Hello. In this episode, I'm joined by Professor Michael Drout of the English Department, the English and Philosophy Department, and the director of the Center for the Study of the Medieval at Wheaton College in Massachusetts, not the one in Illinois. And Professor Drout is about to release a book on the 2nd of December called The Tower and the Ruin, which I would urge everyone to go out and pre-order because it's a fantastic book. I was able to read the book in preparation for this interview with Professor Drout, and I think it'll be one of the defining books for Tolkien scholarship, and my hope is that it will also encourage other people to read Tolkien as well. So I really enjoyed my discussion with Professor Drout, and I hope you enjoy. Unfortunately, some of my audio isn't always the best. I think I was turning away from the microphone too much, so I apologize about that. But I think the content of the discussion is well worth listening to, so please enjoy.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd like to start with this idea that, and you mentioned this in chapter 1 of the book, that Tolkien supposedly creates a mythology for England, and this has been debunked, I suppose, quite a few times. But I think you do this really clearly in the first chapter, and then you give what I think is a more plausible reading of his sort of initial creative impulse, which is that Tolkien was really interested in sort of inventive acts of synthesis, which is, I think, your words in the book, synthesis of scholarship and imagination. I find that much more sort of convincing as a starting point. I guess, is it possible for you to say something about why that mythology, I guess, of the mythology for England has become so popular, and why it seems to need repeated debunking in books and from various, Tolkien scholars?
So the phrase "mythology for England" comes from Humphrey Carpenter's biography, and we need a new biography of Tolkien, not so much for the life events, but for an intellectual biography. So sort of like what John Garth does for Tolkien and the Great War, but continued on. And there's lots of pieces of this that people have done. There's there's an article identifying a new influence or a new source. But the other reason is that I'm always kind of shocked to realize how much Humphrey Carpenter's book set the agenda for Tolkien scholarship for almost 50 years now. It's just mind-boggling that the categories and the ways of looking at things that he came up with when he didn't even really like the Lord of the Rings or that material. Like when you read the biographical stuff about him, he just went to the family because, like, I'm from Oxford, I understand the world, I can communicate the world, but it's set the agenda. So many like of his quotes that aren't even like Tolkien's quotes, but his like paraphrases or whatever have just, and mythology for England is the biggest one. And I think it's a complete red herring, especially because in the letter that the closest phrase comes from, Tolkien says he that was once his idea, but now in 1949, 51 or whatever he's writing to Milton Waldman, he's like, but of course that's not what I'm doing now.
Absurd.
Um, so that's one part of it, but I'm not sure he was even really doing it then in the sense that other people go with, which is that, like, okay, first of all, we have to define what a mythology is. I mean, and good luck with that, right? And two, then we have to see, like, is that what he was doing in those Silmarillion materials, in the poems? And I don't think it is. Like, it's not a story of gods and heroes told in like the way that Greek mythology or Snorri Sturluson in Norse mythology is. It's a very different beast, especially that the original stuff was all trying to write poems, like on their, for their own sake. And then what I think was really, really cool, you can now see in the Hammond and Skull edition, is that like the invented names, the invented ideas just sort of start creeping in, and you can tell like that he's sort of discovering, right, that, oh, I can use these other this imaginary this world I'm creating in my head. But it starts out, they're kind of like they're trying to be ordinary, I don't want to say ordinary poems, but they're trying to be like what a poem was to somebody, in his age, his time period, what he was looking to. So, I mean, I think Carpenter just gives people the impression that he set out to create an English pantheon and all that, and that's not really what happened. And I have like two takes in the book. The one is that it's, if you want to find the origin of anything, it's where he suddenly seems to realize that he can use his, what we would now call, what they didn't call it then, but creative writing ability, right? His ability to invent stories and people and characters, and he can use that to try to explain things that are scholarly puzzles. But you also realize, like, and especially I realized from some of the letters and even some of the things that in my correspondence with Christopher Tolkien back in the early 2000s, he was really worried about that. Like it's also in the Beowulf, the Beowulf commentaries edition. Like, him and Christopher were concerned that, like, the philologists would come at them with guns blazing, as I think one of the phrases, and because he knew it wasn't the normal way of going about things, because he knew, if there was enough evidence to prove that Arundel was actually some kind of voyager or sailor, you'd be able to write it up, but they're, in a scholarly journal, but the evidence is just absent. So on the one hand, Tolkien's solutions are beautiful. They're, oh, what a brilliant idea in every possible way, but they can't be scholarship just because the evidence doesn't exist. And so I think that's what I mean by the imaginative synthesis of. So I'll give you another example, which I don't remember if I talked about in the book or not, and it's really Tom Shippey's anyway. But Snorri says there are light elves, dark elves, and dwarves. And no less than Jacob Grimm comes along and says, "Well, that's just ridiculous. There's elves and dwarves, and that's it. And there's no such thing as dark elves anyway." And so Tolkien's like, it's true. There's no other evidence for dark elves except someone who was hundreds of years closer to the tradition than we are. So, but what if there was this one? If there's this idea that some elves, right, call themselves light elves or dark elves in a kind of elvish racism, saying like, we are the better elves because we saw the light of the two trees, and there's dark elves. And then even more, there's this one particular guy who likes to dress in black and wear black armor, so he would be, a dark elf, and he only comes out at night, and then finally his best friends are all dwarves, so you can see how someone later would confuse dark elves with dwarves, because, and again, great, amazing story. That, like, everything about that is so powerful, and it feels intuitively right. But it's not scholarship; it's creation. And this is where Shippey has originally came up with that Tolkien created out of cruces, out of problems in medieval literature that can't be solved, that you sort of have to just ram right through it or pick a side or whatever. And those are all over the place. Like the word burglar, which I didn't even realize. It shows up in Simone Darden's edition of The Life and the Passion of St. Juliana. That's the first time it shows up in English, and it's not entirely clear what it means. Right? Is a burglar someone who breaks in when there's someone home, and then it's very much more, dangerous, or is it someone who sneaks in and steals things when there's nobody home? And then you look at one of the chapters in The Hobbit is not at home, and nobody can figure out what Bilbo is. Is he a burglar? Is he a servant? Is he supposed to steal stuff? Is he? And then you realize that whether Tolkien was conscious of this or not, he'd been mulling it over. My best example on this stuff is Golfenbull. So it's the first draft of The Hobbit, he has the joke about Bulroar knocking the head off of the goblin, and it flew 100 yards and went down a rabbit hole, and thus was the battle won and the game of golf invented at the same moment. He gives the Goblin King's name as Fingolfin, like one of his greatest characters from the. And I obviously this means that at that point he was not thinking of the Legendarium and the Hobbit as connected, but also that he'd be willing to use one of his beautiful, elf names as a Goblin King. Why? Because he wanted to make a joke about golf. And the reason for that is the etymology of golf is unknown. I didn't connect all those things until someone asked me, where does golf come from? It doesn't sound like a Scottish word. I'm like, no, it doesn't. And then I looked it up, and it's like etymology obscure. And then I'm like, he looked it up at some point too, and then came up with a story that explained it. So that's what I meant by inventive synthesis, as being at the sort of the foundation of the way he worked, and a lot of his inspirations seem to have come from that. Wrestling with the problem, like, how could we make this make sense? Well, I don't have the evidence to make it sense, but I'll give you a story. And his stories are always better than anything. Even I think if we knew the real answer, I'll bet Tolkien stories were better. But,
the Arendelle poem is a good example of that, which you talk about.
Yeah.
And in that first chapter, you also talk about how Tolkien, I guess, uses or has been influenced by 19th century redactions or translations or otherwise imaginative retellings of medieval literature. You talk about H. Rider Haggard, I think, and William Morris. So I think that was an emphasis that I hadn't seen before in for example, Shippey. I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering having read his books, but because of course there is that sieve through which those medieval works come in the 19th century, and perhaps in a new intellectual biography that would be an important place to go.
And we know that, he used his Skeet Prize money to buy William Morris books. And in Beowulf for the Critics, he mentions, like, Morris's translation of Sigurd, which is the absolute worst possible meter somebody uses Morris's Sigurd meter for Beowulf. And he says, for this is the worst possible meter to use for Beowulf. And it's not even good when Morris uses it for Sigurd. And it's the same. That's where I got this from when I edited that. God knows how long ago, 25 years ago. He also mentions H. Rider Haggard's Eric Bright Eyes, so I went and read it. I know it's been, Oronzo Chili's book on the Tolkien's library mentions it. Other people have mentioned it, but I don't think that they read it. I don't think they really got into reading it, because it's not a easy read. It's weird. But what I got out of that weirdness, because I've read, She and King Solomon's Mines, which are like page turners, and what I got is, Rider Haggard is trying to imitate Old Norse, the way Old Norse seems when you're just learning it, and when you can't read it fluently, but so you're translating it like slowly with usually in a group of people, and suddenly the tense changes to present tense, and you're like, what the heck happened to the verbs? And someone tells you, oh, that just happens in Old Norse. But Haggard only does it for action scenes. So what I got from that was, like, okay, this is my experience. I'm learning about this new thing. And there is, like, for the right person, when you first learn Beowulf or read Gown of the Green Knight or the Kalevala, even in 19th century translations, you get this sense of, like, ooh, that's weird and different, and I like it. And I think that's what, going back to Walter Scott, he just did it in the dialogue, right? But he still thought he had to imitate the medieval stuff in some way. And then Haggard clearly thinks that to make it a good Old Norse, pastiche or whatever, he needs to imitate the style. And I think it doesn't work. And then if I have a discovery at all, it's that I noticed that Tolkien did the same thing in the first half of The Fall of Gondolin, and then he stopped doing it as it went on. And that's just incredibly fortunate, like, for understanding it, because The Fall of Gondolin is not that long, and he never went back to it. It was the very first thing that he wrote. So I'm just lucky that, like, halfway through, he's like, I'm not doing this present tense thing anymore. Whatever reason, he stops with the present tense. So it stood out as like, okay, this is an imitation of the Old Norse style, but it's coming through Haggard, because in Old Norse, it just happens at random. I went and looked, and there are probably 20 articles that all argue different, like, reasons for it, and they're all at cross purposes, and they all basically end up saying, like, well, it's not really consistent, but it probably is X or probably Y. And I think that means that Tolkien's not taking it directly from the Old Norse. He knows the Old Norse, but he's not using it the same way. The same way he's not using, like, the poems in Old Norse are used in a way that's more closer to what Tolkien does in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, and that's in contrast to the other guy, William Morris, who, to me at least, it's clear that Morris's prose is just there to string the poems together.
Yeah.
And that's kind of medieval prosimetrum, and is like that. Like the poetry is really important and good, and the prose gets me from one poem to the next. And Tolkien inverts that, right? The prose is, I don't think it's a good idea to skip reading the poems, but I also know that many of my students do, and many other people also skip the poems, and you can still get the story. So anyway, that was where I was coming up with that, is that these are people that he read, plus he was doing the scholarship on it. And when he says then in that letter to Edith, I wanted to capture something in the air.
Yes.
I think that's what that is. And of course, that's just got to be an interpretation, because he never comes out and says there's something in the air. You wouldn't describe it that way if you could easily articulate what it was. And I think it's the sense of being damaged by the passage of time, so that we don't fully understand it. So there's parts that are missing. There are parts that the references just don't connect for us. And that's where he figured out, I think that among his many geniuses, he figured out how to create that in a modern English work, that same feeling. And that's why we, even if you've never read Beowulf or any of the other old texts, you still get the feeling of that's why people act like the Lord of the Rings is true in some way. It's not that they believe that there's an actual dragon that lives somewhere, but it has the sense of that it was created by someone who believed it was true.
Yes, yeah.
Which I wish I had said in the book, because that's the best way of it. that it gives you the impression that the author believes is true, rather than the author believes it is artful, clever, entertaining, or whatever. But the book's narration implies that everything happening is true.
Yes, yeah, and I think that comes through in the book. And you talk about reading the Lord of the Rings as an experience, is sort of the way you put it, in several places. And I think since I heard that talk that you gave years ago at Carnegie Mellon University, which has been online for a while now, that's what I thought. Yeah, that really resonates. That really resonates with my just intuitive sense of reading the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, which is why I was excited for this book. But I had a question about that, because although I'm convinced by the argument and sort of resonate with it, and perhaps the book, you do say in the prologue, I think, or the introduction, that the book is really for people who have some awareness of Tolkien, and you don't spend heaps of time in the book sort of trying to, this is what happens, this is the plot. It's like this. Clearly, you expect people to understand what you're talking about. But if, I don't know, some sort of Twitterati, picks up the book and thinks, oh, this could be interesting. It's funny that there are sort of cohorts of people who are quite devoted, still to modernism and think it's the height of literature, and maybe it is. I don't know, but I feel like people like that are going to come to you and say, well, every book is an experience. Like what are you talking about? What is this? I feel like you do explain in the book.
That's a reasonable critique. One of my current students, one of my best students, I love this student. She is so sharp, and she took the Tolkien class. She'd had another class with me and enjoyed it, and so she took the Tolkien class because I was teaching it, and she hadn't read The Lord of the Rings. And I keep making these statements, like, well, that's why it feels like something other than reading a book, and she'd be like, but it doesn't. But it's just another book, and I just read it, and I liked some parts, but I and that's a legitimate critique. I mean, I think my analysis is to say that I know for sure that there's a lot of people who feel like it's an experience, and I'm trying to explain why it works that way for them. But if it doesn't feel like an experience to you, I can't make you, like, there's no argument that I'm going to make that's going to make you say, oh yeah, it really is like an experience. I want to do it every year now. Like that just won't work that way. It's just like, I keep, as I talk about these things, I keep realizing how weird people's reaction to Tolkien is. Like, there just isn't that for almost anything. Like, I've read it 50 times, right? Like, who does that? Except I'm not even close to being alone. And what other books do people do that besides like Goodnight Moon or something? You know,
Yeah.
the Runaway Buddy, or some kind of child's board book that you read a million times to your kids. But and people, like, I know many people who, like, when my students go off and get married and have kids, that one of the things that they'll do is they'll send pictures of their baby with them holding a copy of the Lord of the Rings, saying like, well, not quite yet, but soon I'm going to get to read it to her. That's a really weird phenomenon. It's very hard to find other works, other authors that have that.
Yes.
And unless you're going to really just, and also I should say that the history of it does not suggest that this is a marketing phenomenon. I mean, more inept marketing you could not find for the Lord of the Rings. They didn't understand what their audience was. They didn't understand, and how could they? Because it was so weird, so so different from everything else. They just knew it. Give Stanley Unwin and Lewis and others credit. They knew it was good, but they didn't know who it would appeal to or how. And there's the explanations are really lame too. It's like, oh, it's the ace paperback books controversy. Yeah, like, right. In the 1960s, among college students, people cared about publishing rights in paperback book copyrights. Come on. It caught on by word of mouth. It never had, it didn't have a film until 1978. And and that wasn't terribly successful. I actually liked it a lot, but it wasn't, terribly. They wouldn't even let Ralph Bakshi finish it, the way that he wanted to do it.
Yeah.
So none of those things. It's a grassroots. People read it and they want to pass it on, and that's why critics say like the Tolkien cult or something. It's a little bit like a cult, except there's nobody running it, and there's no there's no benefit to it from the cult, but and that's why I think it's experiential. But so my answer is, well, this is actually going to sound modernist or postmodernist or whatever, is that it's not productive, or it's not helpful to like try to have some kind of universal ranking system for all works of literature. Instead, it's, you got to tell me what your like ranking system is. What's your valuation system? And then if I agree with that, then we can see where the works fit in. If I don't agree with that, then you're going to rate things really differently than me, and that's fine, as long as you argue for your your position. What doesn't work is when we say, well, of course, everyone knows that you know William Faulkner is the ultimate achievement of prose in English, and we should compare. You could get away with that if you said the Iliad or the Odyssey are the like they used to, right? There's the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then there's Virgil, and then there's Shakespeare, and then there's, but we don't have that anymore. And for good reason, that these sets of values that everybody judges things are different. And I don't think that's a problem, as long as you articulate your reasons for valuing the thing. And I think that's what I do at the end of the book, is to say, like, here's why it's valuable to me, but your mileage may vary. It might be valuable to you for a different reason, or not valuable to you at all, or you might be like my student Liliana, who's it's just another book.
Yeah.
And that's great. I mean, I put her in the acknowledgments, because that is a great challenge, to have that come back. But yeah, that, I don't know. I actually think, if you really want to, and this is what Shippey does so well, right? He actually goes to the modernists and they say, well, here's what makes a good book. And then Shippey takes a checklist and puts the Lord of the Rings up there and say, oh, it checks off everything in your checklist. And they're like, no, we didn't mean that. Right? Artists must take their ideas wherever they go, unless it includes elves. Elves are right out. Incestuous dukes from Tierra del Fuego, but no elves.
Yeah, and I should say, I think you make an argument, obviously, in the book for this experiential sort of reading. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. And as part of that, going back to ruins and textual ruins, as we were sort of getting towards before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love how the book is arranged. So you deal with with the origins, which we sort of talked about, the Arundel poem, the inventive synthesis, and then you go through the frame narratives and then other features. And by the way, I love how both you and Giuseppe Pizzini have chapters on frame narratives, because I think that's becoming more accepted in Tolkien studies, insofar as I follow vaguely what's going on in the field. Because I feel like there was a long time there that people sort of denied that was even, it was a thing, but it was kind of like, you quote Verlin Flieger a few times saying, well, it doesn't really work. It's sort of
Well, I think but Vernon and I, what we agree on, and we actually like said this out loud one time at a conference, like almost like talked over each other simultaneously, is that Tolkien only got anything ever done when he stopped working on the frame. He had to
yeah.
like get the frame out of his hands somehow before he would finish things. But I do think the frames are really important, and how could he not think about that when the greatest medieval work in English, the Canterbury Tales, is the most inventive frame. It's the first time anyone's made a frame that interpenetrates with the story, where the especially like with the Canning Yeoman and stuff later on, but where stuff in the stories almost comes out and goes in the frames, or the frame goes into the stories, and it becomes this whole organic thing. And how could he studied that, he knows all the dream visions, and Dante and Boccaccio, and how could he not, when he's, or Snorri for that matter, for thinking of all the ways that he starts out with the Cottage of Lost Play, and there's a voyage, and there's a guy named Alfwine, and then he's going to learn these stories, and then the stories are about the Silmarillion material, and each of the stories is intended to have a different narrator who has a different like take on it. Like he was obsessed with it, I think. The Notion Club papers, it's the same thing, and I just think it's actually, there's two parts to this. One is that it's really easy for that to get out of control. And I give you example A, George R. R. Martin, where I think if you add everything up in the last book, there are something like over 30 point of view characters.
Yeah.
It proliferates, and then you just can't. I don't think writers can keep a handle on it. There's a reason that Faulkner's As I Lay Dying is like his shortest. The almost every chapter with a different. I just think that's really hard to keep a handle on if it's not just mechanical like Boccaccio. Like there's 10 nights, there's 10 people, your story one, night one, story one. So that's one part of it. And I also think that was the frame narrative was where Tolkien could indulge in his scholarly stuff, like the Notion Club papers, where I've got and I've played with this too and stuff that I wrote. Like it's really fun to just make up footnotes about stuff and make up scholars, and talk in that academies about things that don't really exist. It's just highly, to me, it's highly amusing to like read something that says, well, Warmald says that this, but clearly this is not possible, and imitate all the worst aspects of academia in a kind of in a fun way. So I think that's one of the things that's going on with the frames. But then he just, it gets much more sophisticated, and he clearly thought about it a lot, right? Like that's the appendix F with the whole, everything in modern English was in the common speech, but then things that were in the language of the North, I translated. I used the names from the North, but not and Rohirrim speak Anglo-Saxon because that was closest. And I mean, it doesn't actually work in the sense that if you read the draft, he was not thinking of that when he was doing that. Like he didn't come up with that overarching thing. He just wanted to have the Rohirrim speak Anglo-Saxon. That was, they just did. But it is, you can, then he wants to make it all work and to make it all make sense. And that's that the Red Book frame narrative. And then I know I'm pushing it further than he, I think, initially thought through. Initially, it's just like, put the poems in. I have this poem here. But I think later on, when he starts saying, and then Findegil, the king's writer,
Oh yeah, yeah.
must have added things. That's how you can, at least to yourself, justify. Like, I have no problem with Sam reciting words in a language that he doesn't know, because I feel like that's the kind of spiritual, semi-magical thing and the whole point is it's just Sam, and yet he's speaking in Quenya, and and I just can't buy that he remembers it to make it, write it down somewhere. And that's the kind of thing that it's like Bede with Cadman's hymn. Bede gives a Latin translation of Cadman's hymn and says, that doesn't really capture what the poetry is, but it's the best I can do. And somebody else comes along and writes Cadman's hymn in the margin in Old English. It's like, it's this, Bede. And I can see, like, you can imagine that, probably Frodo or Sam was like, and he cried out with words. They didn't even know what they meant. And then the scribe is like, oh, I know what words they were. It's related to, we who are in this terrible peril of dreadful death call upon you, Elbereth, please save us. And all of that, I think it actually then hangs together really well, except for like one or two unavoidable places. And that's pretty amazing too, that he can do that, even if it does mean that I have to stop criticizing the Talking Fox, which I've hated for years.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Been made fun of for how much I dislike the Talking Fox, but
there is a Reddit page for the Talking Fox now. People quite
is there really?
Yeah, there is. r/the Talking Fox. Yeah, it's quite popular. Yeah.
What does it say?
It's mostly fox memes, I think, but yeah, the sort of the foxes sort of looking at various things and thinking about it's kind of fun, but obviously,
so it's like the fox's take on other events in the Lord of the Rings. And oh, that's great. Actually, I love that.
Yeah, no,
okay, that I can live with. Yeah,
right,
because the whole gimmick is like hobbits sleeping out of doors.
Yeah, exactly.
What is the world coming to? And I can see now you could make great memes out of that, about anything else.
And then it says he never found anything else about it, but maybe he did. I don't know.
He didn't find out about that, but he knew a lot about
that's right.
going the wrong way or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And so these first few chapters, you develop that the argument for why or how Tolkien uses these sort of formal features, if you like, to create this experiential kind of sense of reading, and that you then sort of talk about this concept of Heimweh, or homesickness, or nostalgia, that is, I guess, for you and sort of intuitively for me, and I guess many other people, the sort of central emotion, particularly of the Lord of the Rings, and it sort of in some sense, sort of arises out of his use of the frame narrative, broken references, other features you talk about, and that more subtle emulation of I guess medieval textuality, which you talk about. He's not using the present tense, like H. Rider Haggard, as you mentioned, but he's developing other features in his mature writing, and sort of, I guess I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on Shippy's discussion of sort of langoth, or longing. So Shippy kind of picks up on that too. And I think in your book in particular, this is the strongest argument put so far for that. Most readers, though, will sort of emphasize, I guess, I don't know most, but a lot of readers will emphasize eucatastrophe, the feeling of the joy that comes, which you do discuss. But I know I'm a bit of a weird reader, I guess. I've always felt like sometimes that can come across as a bit of a cheap consolation. So I'm more interested in this Heimweh, this sort of langoth, as a mature kind of emotion. I guess to what extent do you think Tolkien is aware that he's developing that, and how does that sit with his sort of more sort of theological vision of eucatastrophe, this sort of grace or joy in the final moment of despair.
Well, I mean, a fairly shallow and obvious answer would be that the eucatastrophe has to happen against. It has to be a contrast with something else. If there's not tragedy and sadness and disaster, then the eucatastrophe isn't really a eucatastrophe. It's just another happy thing that happens. And in fact, that's sort of what you can get from the general I don't I actually I love a lot of fantasy and science fiction literature, and I don't want to I'm not going to criticize it for not being Tolkien because that's not what it's for. But the power fantasy kind of thing, like now that I've got my awesome weapon, I will just beat and then basically it's sort of one happy achievement after another with obviously there's conflict and there's dangerous stuff, but it's always the hero keeps coming out of it, ahead, and the story ends with the victory. And obviously, there's tons of children's fantasy that does that, and a lot of the imitative Tolkien fantasy, the Tolklones of the late '70s, early '80s, the Sword of Shannara. The things that David Eddings' Belgariad, and again, these are books I like. I'm not saying, oh, they just suck so bad, but they're not trying to do the same thing. So I think that the one for Tolkien, he needed for that theologically to work. It's that it only works in a fallen world enveloped in sin, and where where death is no longer a gift, but it is something to be feared. And it's a source of strife and terror, and all these bad things are happening in that world, so that the eucatastrophe is a surprise. It's like everything is obviously going to fail here, and playing and eucatastrophe is not the same thing as Deus ex machina. In fact, the better eucatastrophe, like the horns of Rohan, are a great eucatastrophe because he sets up how they got there, and through the geography, through the decisions, the timing, everything else, so that you don't go, oh yeah, of course they arrived just in time.
Yeah, sure.
He had made all that work, maybe more so than the Eagles are coming in the Hobbit. That just, even though I think it works pretty well because you have no idea that that's coming. The battle is like looking to be lost, and then you have something there. So I think that that's part of it. The other thing is just knowing Tolkien's biography and reading every damn thing he wrote before the Lord of the Rings, which, except for maybe something like Farmer Giles of Ham, is just steeped in sadness and tragedy and loss. I mean, the Silmarillion is, I did say this in the book, it's like it's one disaster after another after another. Every character you like dies, not in a horrible way in the George R. R. Martin sense, but just Fingolfin gets crushed by Morgoth. Fingon gets bashed in by a Balrog. Just keep going. They all have something. Fëanor and the Balrogs and Finrod and Sauron and everyone you care about loses. It's a giant loss. It's fighting the long defeat, and then even at the end, it's a loss because Morgoth is defeated. But the Sons of Fëanor stole the Silmarils, and then they ended up lost, and they're dead, and the land is destroyed. And sure, happy victory parade, maybe not so much after the War of Wrath. And part of that is that Tolkien never got around to writing the War of Wrath, and Christopher had to kind of, cobble it together from hints and pieces of draft and guesses. So I think that's what Tolkien really felt all the time, which was this, and I originally wrote it like the article that I got got those ideas first on paper. I used nostalgia, and I did all this stuff to try to recuperate the word nostalgia, and then in two ways. One was my editor at Norton. He's like, "There's too much of this. No one cares," which was like, ouch, but fair. And two was it's not worth a fight, right? When people hear nostalgia, they think like schmaltzy Christmas music stuff. As much as that, again, we do feel that, right? We feel it at holidays, we feel it at family gatherings. We miss the people who aren't there, so it's real. but the word, it doesn't have the valence I want. And then by pure luck, I was looking up its origins, and I discovered that it's actually like a translation into Greek of an actual German word. And I'm like, fine, we're just using the German. We're gonna just use the German word. And and if you want to say that nostalgia is all these other things, right? It's a desire, like the standard thing in kind of, at least within among medievalists, but they got it from Zizek and Deleuze-Guattari, those, the kind of theory gods or whatever, that nostalgia is about desiring the past when you were powerful, when your group was powerful, and now it's not powerful, and so you want the past. And I'm like, it doesn't work for me. Like, people have nostalgia for things when their group was much less powerful, but they were young and they were with their families and stuff like that. I just don't buy it. But it's not worth it. It's not worth the effort. Just put in a new word that doesn't have all of that incrustations of things, and just say it's the sorrow that every single human being feels for lost time. And you can feel that if you had a horrible childhood. You can feel that if you had, if they were an abused child, you still feel nostalgia for the good things back then, whatever they were, that are lost, that you can't get back to. And you feel it as you go through life, that it's the inexorable flow. The time only goes one direction. And I think that's actually consistent with a lot of what Tolkien says about in I didn't this I had to cut because of just length, but in the Notion Club papers, when he's trying to work out the time travel thing, it's like the only way to travel in time or in space is to be incarnated. Your spirit shows in somewhere, and then from wherever it was, or we don't even know. But then it's in that time, and that's what he's trying to play with in that, like that your spirit could move through time in some way, but only by being incarnated into flesh in some particular point. And therefore, once you're in that flesh, then you're in the flow and you can't go backwards. And therefore there are things that are lost in the past. And I will assert that that's a universal human feeling, that as much as you may be raring for the future, there's a feeling like, oh yeah, I used to really care about that stuffed animal or that book, or going to this place that isn't there anymore. And we've all felt it. I think the key thing that is in the mature development is him trying to find a way to make that feeling not just be bleak and and in other words, that the argument is not just accept the inevitable loss and move on, but that there is some kind of, I don't know if it's consolation or a greater understanding of that. And that's when he uses that line, their tears were tears, but blessed and without bitterness. I felt that line just came straight from his heart as what he wanted to feel. I think a lot about there's some material by Father Murphy, who like knew the Tolkiens really well. We published it in Tolkien Studies, just like of a he wrote back and forth with an American graduate student, and who had asked him about Tolkien. He says, I think that what you guys are all missing was that Tolkien was a very depressed man. And this is someone who knew him and loved him, and said he was a very depressed man. He had had a lot of horrible things and a lot of traumas happen to him, and he did his best. I mean, I love the thing I love about Tolkien. There's no like and he beat his wife and cheated on her and ignored his children or whatever. Like, he really was a pretty much of a decent middle class human being. He did his job diligently. He took care of his family when he needed to, and loved it and enjoyed it. He was a good father, and he's also self-aware in his letters. He's like, I know I wasn't a great father, but he was obviously good enough, that, and but yet he was a very depressed and sad person. And I think what you see is, as you get onto that, like, he's writing those words in like 1949 or so, and he's finishing up the Lord of the Rings, which he doesn't know if it's ever going to be published. He spent 12 years on it at that point. He's starting to think about that going to retire into poverty because the pension isn't large enough, and it was a rough time, especially in that immediate post-war period where there's like England is poor and people are hungry for years afterwards. We think of the post-war as like it was the happy days, but they had to rebuild from a lot worse than us, and so I think he's feeling, and he's like, I just wish I'm not even going to ask to be happy. Could I just be like sadness without bitterness, with an acceptance and with a kind of a love in there? And that's what I think and that's what I think separates the Lord of the Rings from just about every fantasy out there, except maybe Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy. Especially there's 5 of them now, whatever. But especially the first 3, where the third one ends in a book about death for teenagers. I still love her audacity. Like, I'm ready to book about death, and that it's like you can't get out of it. You don't get given, like, none of these things. You don't get a like get out of death free card.
No.
You have to accept it, but you have good reasons to accept it after. Like, I always thought that Frodo got to go to heaven because it was the undying lands. I'm like, wow, he's so lucky. And then you read the letters, and it's like, oh, he dies.
Yeah,
he gets healed, but he dies. Maybe they kept him around long enough that Sam could come join him, but then he died. And but yet it's okay because he is healed, and he saved the Shire. Right? So he doesn't die in pain and suffering, and the Shire is saved, and he can be sad, and we can be sad for like the loss of what Frodo didn't ever get to do. He says to Sam, everything I had or would have been is yours. And that can be sad for Frodo, but it's wonderful for Frodo to be able to give it to Sam, to someone who he cares about and he loves. And I just think that's part of the reason the Lord of the Rings is so meaningful to people, is that it doesn't give you, for all the criticism of it, like it's all black and white and the good guys win, the bad guys. It's like, which book did you read?
Yeah. I've often thought that too. Yeah, like, what are they actually talking about? And you have a great.
You guys are all good, well, except for Denethor, Boromir.
yeah, etc. Yeah. Look, just building off that, I wanted to quickly quote something from the book, and you say, I strongly resist the idea that the Silmarillion is a consolation for the good reason that there is simply no relief in the narrative from sorrow and loss. And the word narrative there was interesting, because a lot of people will use the Silmarillion, I think, sometimes as a kind of key, to sort of comprehend and understand the mechanics of Tolkien's universe. So they'll say, well, Tom Bombadil must be a Maya, or something like that, which I disagree with. And in this case, I've often thought, there are certain sentiments in the narratives that Tolkien will express, but then in his later writings, and this is something I talked to Giuseppe about as well, in his later sort of theological writings, which you don't talk about too much in your book, but he'll often go back to his earlier pieces and then produce some sort of explanation or philosophical or theological sort of point that relates to something in the narrative that sort of changes its valence or gives it a new. And that, I guess your mileage may vary as to whether he used his time well in that context. I wish he would have finished The Fall of Gondolin in the later one, but anyway. And a lot of those writings are sort of in the history of Middle Earth and the Nature of Middle Earth volume that came out a couple of years ago. But, and again, you don't talk about this directly in the book necessarily, but I'm just curious how you how do we interpret Tolkien most effectively, do you think? Is it through the narrative, as you've sort of done in this book, and which I would resonate with, or do we treat that later writing as a kind of map to comprehend, understand his earlier work?
I actually get kind of frustrated sometimes, and it's been a thing with my students recently, that I'll have 3 or 4 students in the Tolkien class who have read the Silmarillion before we read it, and they're constantly trying to explain everything that happens in the Lord of the Rings narrative away in terms of the Silmarillion. It's like, oh, when Sam finds the water in Mordor, that's Ulmo who's sending him stuff there, and when this happens, it's and maybe, I think we know from the drafts that that's not the case. That that he wasn't really thinking about. He was thinking of getting the story done. Now, there's a few places. The biggest one to me is something that Tom Hillman pointed out in his book. That it's one of these things that once you see it, you're like, how did I not notice that before? It's a Verlin Flieger. Verlin Flieger's all of her stuff is like that. Like you read it, and it seems like so ordinary, and then you realize like, oh my God, no one of the millions of people who've read this, no one's ever said this point. And so Tom Hillman says when Sam is considering suicide, when he thinks Frodo is dead, he says he might fall on his sword or cast himself from a precipice. And that's Turin and Nienor. The two ways they die right there. And that has got to be like a deliberate resonance, but a lot of the other stuff, I think it wasn't. And then it's fine. Tolkien can retcon like anybody else. He can retcon his own work. I think in the end, he was trying to do something that I've conjectured is impossible. My students even call it the Drout conjecture. I can't prove it, and that's why it's a conjecture. And all you have to do is find one counterexample, and then it would be wrong. But I've never found one. Is that I don't think it is possible to make a completely internally consistent, whether that's a metaphysics with magic or whether it's a science fiction that violates basic Newtonian physics and rules of causality. I don't think you can make one work. And the only way you end up creating more like epicycles, more, fill in the blank. The best way to do it is to not explain anything, and then it works. The more you try to explain the mechanisms behind it, the more contradictions build up. And I think that he spent he had got this idea later, and I see where Giuseppe is coming from in that book, and I like it a lot, right? Where he's like, okay, this is my, my creation, my sub-creation theology belief. Let me see if I can make it all work as a unified system. But I think in the end, he was trying to do something that really is impossible. And so it was a lot of labor expended to end up not, so like all the work in the nature of Middle Earth on orcs. And they must have free will, but then they could be good. But then we didn't know that doesn't work. So maybe they're this. And like, the answer with orcs is that you need to be able to kill orcs and not feel guilt about it, or the story as a story doesn't work. And in fact, the easy solution is what I call the Buffy the Vampire solution, which is that the orcs are a body inhabited by an evil spirit, and when you kill one, you're doing everybody a favor. Buffy has it that like if you get bitten by a vampire, your soul is still trapped in your own body, but the vampire is like driving the bus. So that when you kill a vampire, the soul is set free and the evil vampire is destroyed. That's how you could make orcs work. But that's not what he had worked out about the theology. But when he worked it out, orcs were just like beasts. They didn't talk. They, and this is my other theory about literature. Once you let a character talk, you cannot convince your reader that that is not a character with a full self-awareness. Like if they talk and exhibit free will on their own, you can tell all the one that they don't have free will, but we intuitively don't believe it. Which is the horrible danger with these AIs, these large language models. Because people cannot bring themselves to think like this is just a bunch of, algorithms playing out. Anything that talks to us, we're going to believe. And therefore, then it becomes a real problem that you just slaughtered all the orcs without seeing which ones were good and bad. And that will not make the story work. So to go along with the whole idea then of using the Silmarillion and the later writings to explain everything in the Lord of the Rings. One is I don't think it's phenomenologically correct. Like I don't think that's what he was doing when he wrote those parts. And two, I just don't think it's necessary. And it often works as a distraction from what is the emotional resonance of the scene? What does it mean to you? How does it work? Instead, it's all like, oh yeah, well I know, this is Varda doing this, and I just
or Eri pushing Gollum off the edge.
Yeah, exactly. Like, do we really want that? Like, like that. In other words, that that basically God reaches into the story and flicks things with his finger, as opposed to like things work the way they do because of some deeper underlying dynamics or processes that we don't fully understand. And
Yes.
I like it when that's happening. When if it's really that you say, "May the valor turn him aside," and that's why the Oliphant doesn't stomp everybody.
Mm,
That's
mm, mm.
lame. That's
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why are they doing that? If they're going to do that, they should just smash Sauron flat and move on. Like that, again, you have these elaborate ideas. Well, they could only send messengers, and I like that because it makes sense. But at a certain point, why are they playing? If that's the case, why are they playing with the lives of innocent people just to balance things out for some kind of, you know, Manichaean fairness doctrine or something?
Mm, mm,
It's all, you know, again, that's I don't think you can make a
mm,
self-consistent
mm,
system
mm,
that
mm.
violates causality and action at a distance. That's the two big ones, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Conservation of energy you can kind of fudge in some ways. Draws on the deep, fathomless energies of the universe. But action at a distance and causality
Mm.
are a real stumbling block.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Look, you've been very generous with your time. So just to finish out, the final chapter, or the coda, if you like, is very beautiful, and that's very moved. And you mentioned that reading Tolkien doesn't really assuage grief, and you mentioned nothing can, um, but you do sort of restate the idea that it can be consoling to imagine, I guess, a world in which there is more than memory beyond the circles of the world, even if personally you or I or others or you may not believe that our world actually operates in that way. Um, and I think that was a beautiful sentiment. I just want to ask, that quote, that notion of more than memory is something that sort of, I think, comes from Aragorn in the Aragorn and Arwen.
Yeah, in the Tale of Aragorn and Arwen.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, one thing that's almost always struck me about that, and this goes back to that Heimweh feeling, is that Arwen seems to remain fairly unconvinced by that. And she even says, well, now I understand the Numenorians, why they did what they did, and then she goes to Lothlorien, talk about Heimweh, like the trees are fading, and she lies down on Karen Amaroth and dies. Fairly.
You want to say that Tolkien is all sappy and romantic, and read the Tale of Aragorn and Arwen.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, wow, you feel like that maybe him and Edith had a bad weekend when he wrote that or something too. But
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, being facetious, but right. But she says also, you know what, Aragorn, our whole lives together, I pretty much thought you humans were selfish and stupid, and what was wrong with you. But
Mm,
now I actually know. It's like,
mm,
whoa,
mm,
there's that, and then right, then she isn't really, she's an elf. It's not natural to her, even though
mm,
she's
mm,
chosen um, to throw in her lot with humans, and so he says, well, hopefully we will, beyond the circles of the world, and the more than memory, like that is such a poignant line because memory is all you have,
mm,
right? And
mm.
especially when you've lost someone very, very close. And just so your
Yeah.
listeners understand, we're like, and I appreciate like you're being really kind about it, but I wrote that material at the end because we
Mm,
lost our son in 2022 from a fentanyl overdose, and he was only
mm,
18. And I wrote this whole book immediately afterwards. Like I
mm,
started it
mm.
in the September or so of 20. I think it was probably not until January of 23 that I got going on it, and I
Yeah,
really wrote it in the fall of 23. And it was me, kind of trying to
yeah.
understand things. And that line, more than memory, it's all I ask for. And of course,
Mm,
you don't
mm,
know, right? But that's the desire. When all you have is memory, can there be something else where it won't just be in my
mm,
head looking back at something? And it's such a beautiful, poignant line. And then Tolkien again, like just like he does all the time, he doesn't stay on that. He's like, oh, and then Arwen wept, and she like great. No one can stand to speak to her because of the grief in her face, and she walks to Lothlorien, it seems, and dies. And nobody knows where her grave is. Everything is forgotten uh, about her. It's like, whoa, like that is being tough minded in every way, and yet the book does, I think, to me at least, it says, yeah, our world isn't this way. The horns of Rohan don't come. And by the way, I think part of it is also that being the winning side in World War II has shaped so many of our cultures, and then therefore, our understanding of everything. But like the good guys don't always arrive in time. And those kinds of things, the horns of Rohan, or then the ship comes up the river and surprise, it's the good guys. It could have just been a bunch of pirates. And there's so many other variants of that, but it does make us feel like if our world doesn't work this way, a world or something that does work this way is possible. I can imagine it. And it's not like a the reason I think it's effective is that it's not utopia. It's not where everything is perfect. It's not like where in the Gospels where it says and then there will be a time when there will be no tears and no loss and no death. And I hope, but Middle Earth isn't that. It just has a few moments, and that's enough. In a way, that's more because that's a more believable. I don't know how to put that. That's the right word, but it's an easier to believe. Like I have to have a lot of faith, and to believe the real promise. I don't have to have nearly as much to believe that maybe there's a world, whether it's in the future or was in the past or something, where it's just a little bit has the eucatastrophe in it. So that's what I was, I mean that was a really weird thing to write because so much of it, I mean, it's more like polished than anything I've ever written. I've rewritten it more than anything, except that it kind of came like as it came, and even that part where I say like didn't work. I thought I was going to get to this point in the narrative and say like, oh, it's a constellation. Sorry, I wish I could say that. And I was, by the way, tempted to lie because I struggled with it for so long. I was tempted to say, yeah, and that's what it does. And I'm glad I didn't, but it was hard, to say that and then say, yeah, okay, but you know what? Asking a book to console you for the death of a child is a bit of a high standard. That's asking a little too much of a book. But here's what it does do, and here's what it can do. And I've it's not officially published yet, but I've heard from people who have, like my copy editor, also one of the and this is not only about the book, this is just about a life. When you lose someone like that and to a drug overdose, you suddenly discover that there's way more people around you than you ever expected who are dealing with the same thing. I have been shocked at how many people, like, just I'm leading this tour in England, and we finished the tour at the Tolkien gravesite, and I had a tough time getting through some of the passages I wanted to read there. And we're going back from the tour, and I'm sitting, and it's a British bus with two levels. I'm up the top. I think I'm by myself, and then I hear someone crying, and behind me, it's one of the women who was on the tour. And I started talking to her, and she's like, "Yeah, well, I lost my sister to an overdose 2 years ago," and it's like everywhere. So that's been it's been really eye opening. It's also eye opening to realize like how many people are dealing with really tough things and just keeping it to themselves or among their close friends, but not broadcasting it anyway, and just dealing with it. And I think that's another reason. I got emails from people who were um, in the wars in the Middle East who brought the Lord of the Rings with them. Because I've done some of these audio courses that they had listened to, and they would write back and say, when I was sitting there in Fallujah, and two of my closest friends had just been killed by an IED, I trying to not become filled with hate, I went and read, this or that passage in the Lord of the Rings, and it really is. It's been a lifeline for a lot of people, myself included. And again, that's really weird. Find me a Nobel Prize winning work of literature that does that regularly. And I'm not putting those down. I love, I've devoted my career to studying literature, and I love all of it. But it doesn't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, I can tell you that I think Toni Morrison's Beloved is an amazing book because it out Faulkner's Faulkner, and it does Faulkner better than Faulkner himself did Faulkner, and I like enjoy reading it. I enjoy teaching it,
Yeah.
but I'm not reaching for that in a moment of crisis.
Grief. Yeah. That's fascinating, and I think I think for me at least, your book does a wonderful job of making that case, and I'll just say it's a great mix or a great blend of the clearly very scholarly, and I love all the footnotes, and
I cut the footnotes down so much.
Yeah, right.
There would have been so many more footnotes if I'd had my way, but that's the other thing I have to say is I don't think I've ever had an editor as good as the guy I had at Norton. He I think most editors I've had before have either been gatekeepers or cheerleaders, and he was trying to make this book the best my book it could be, not his book, not and I really lucked out there. I got a great editor.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that's really good to hear. And obviously I've read the pre corrections copy, but obviously I've already ordered the copy, so I'll read it again when it comes. And I think, have you narrated the audiobook as well?
Yes, actually on Tuesday I went in and did the last corrections for that.
Great.
In which I learned that I should just not use the word concomitant because I can't say it. Because it's obviously not a normal word that people use in speech. And that was my wife's comment. It's like, well, how about you don't use those words that you never say? Because that's why you don't know how to pronounce them right. Because there was a few concomitant and panegyric and sobriquet. And I'm like, you know what? I think you're right. What I learned a lot from doing the audiobook. I learned that my parenthetical asides that I really like are the absolute worst thing to do in audio, and I should never do one of those again. Because trying to get the intonation right on those things is brutal. I really learned a lot, and I have amazing. I have so much appreciation for the editors again. My producer slash engineer slash editor is sitting there and he's catching every dropped S, every slight mispronunciation, every wrong intonation, and I'm just in awe of the ability that people have for that.
Yeah, that's great. And just to finish up, I mean, look, it's great that it's being published by Norton. I know it's sort of shallow to think like this, but it's nice to have a book coming out from a major publisher that's on Tolkien, and I know Shippey's books are great, but I've always had in the back of my head Brian Roseberry's comment that, oh well, they were published by Tolkien's publishers, so what do we expect, But
I never heard him say that.
It's he says that in the latest edition, 2003 edition of Tolkien Cultural Phenomenon.
Oh, I have that on my shelf. I just missed the line when I reread it.
That's all right. It's somewhere in the introduction, but it's a little facetious. I'm like, well, maybe that's going a bit far, but it's good to have a book from Norton. Yeah, maybe they'll put him in the.
I hope that that if I hope it's well, of course I hope it's successful, but I hope that means that there's I was amazed that there's an audiobook of that they bought the rights to the audio, that not Norton but recorded books, because who wants an audiobook of a scholarly book with, they don't put the footnotes in the audio, or most of them. Only some of the footnotes made the cut, but that's an encouraging sign that people would maybe want to listen to that, and that there could be, and I mean I hope. I think you imply that I did manage. I mean, you're a Tolkienist too, so but that I really tried to make it without compromising on what I was trying to say, but also be able to communicate to an audience not of pedantic former medievalist scholars. I mean, I can do that. I can do that until the cows come home. but I was trying to do,
Yeah.
because I think Christopher de Hamel, who did a great book called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. He's just a brilliant. He was the former Parker librarian at Cambridge, and he's a book collector and manuscript. And he was saying to me that the reason that he opened up like the Parker Library and let school groups come in and and stopped being like so exclusive that no one can see the stuff we have, is that if you don't make it meaningful to people, they won't support it. And in the long run, in democratic societies, you have to have support, or else it's going to go away. You can't rely on that. We can just demand, the king can say that this library is important. And, and basically that's what I believe too. Like that, if we want literary studies and we want people to not hate literary studies, and this is also probably an American thing versus, given political situations there, I come across so many people who are actually, I think, are overall well-meaning. They're just frustrated with the expense of universities and the political bias and whatever. But they're like, well, all this stuff is so useless. You should only go to college if you're learning science. Or I'm married to an engineer, by the way. I went to Carnegie Mellon for undergrad. Like, I'm not anti-science. I just think that there's a lot to be gained by the liberal arts, by studying literature.
Yeah.
But we can't act like jerks about it. We can't act like that we're monks. And if we want to act like we're like monks, then we have to act like that and be disciplined and not, and we're not doing that. So the other thing is to reach out and to invite people into the conversation and to just say that, like, if you're an intelligent person who can read The Lord of the Rings, then you can talk about it this way too. That's what I hoped to get. And I feel really strongly about not being exclusionary about this stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Even about like technical medieval stuff, I think you can explain it to a smart, normal person, and they can get it.
And I would very much also read like a very technical medievalist version of your book, but look, it's good that it is inclusive, I guess, and very very readable. So yeah, I think that very much succeeds in that regard.
I hope that. I mean, who knows? I'm almost dreading the release, because that there will be the equivalent of like YouTube commenters or whatever who they just hate everything, and I should just ignore that. But it's hard.
Yeah.
I looked at some of the comments under my Carnegie Mellon talk from 2013, and like, why do you care that I wore an orange tie? Like, why would that upset you so much that you're going to call me a jerk or whatever because I wore an orange tie?
Yeah, no, there's people have all sorts of hang-ups.
No, as you do this stuff, and that there's just there's difficult people out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, look, Michael Drout, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time, and obviously, I'm sure the book will succeed, and I hope it does. And I look forward to reading the hard copy when I get it. So, thanks for coming on the Reading Tolkien podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, and happy to come back anytime it seems like it makes sense. And I will look forward to talking to you in the future.
All right, thanks.
Okay.